In the early hours of an ordinary Monday, Captain Ibrahim Traoré found himself awakening from a dream so vivid, so intensely real, that the weight of its message clung to him like the sweat on his brow. It wasn't the first time he'd dreamt of danger, of smoke rising over the Sahel or gunfire echoing through rural villages. But this dream was different. It didn't show a nation in peril. It showed a nation reborn, unified, strong, defiant. In this dream, Traoré stood on the steps of a marble palace, his nation calm and secure behind him. Around him, soldiers in newly fashioned uniforms marched in unison, eyes forward, resolute. The flags that flapped in the wind bore no foreign insignias, no outside influence. Children laughed in the streets. Elders sang ancient songs with pride. There were no drones overhead, no foreign tongues dictating policy from afar. Only the pulse of a people who had taken back what was theirs. He sat up in bed, breathing heavily. That vision haunted him, not because it was frightening, but because it was beautiful and felt so impossibly far from reality. The current state of Burkina Faso was one of fragmentation and fear. The people were disillusioned, many corners of the country remained lawless, and the government's dependence on outside aid had left their sovereignty hanging by a thread. For months, Traoré had wrestled with the cracks forming in his leadership. He had come to power with hope burning in his chest, promising a new era, an era of Burkinabe pride and protection. Yet the machinery of global politics, the sheer inertia of conflict, had slowed his progress. Worse, whispers of betrayal circled him. Distrust festered among his own ranks. Something needed to change, drastically. That morning, instead of summoning his cabinet or advisors, Traoré walked the palace grounds alone. The sky above Ouagadougou was overcast, clouds thick and unmoving, like the uncertainty that plagued his mind. But the vision from his dream wouldn't let go. The marble steps, the harmonious march, the unbroken flags. He understood now what he had to do. It wasn't just about fighting terror. It was about reclaiming dignity. He returned to his quarters, washed his face, and sat at his desk. He didn't hesitate. With a pen in hand, he began to scribble plans, not military offensives, not vague political rhetoric, but a complete transformation of the country's security philosophy. This wouldn't be a reform, it would be a rebirth. He titled it S24/7, Security, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The core principle was simple: permanent vigilance nationwide. No more temporary deployments, no more foreign trainers steering strategy. Burkina Faso would rely on its own people, its own terrain, its own understanding of the conflict. To support this, every village would have its own watch, every district its own defense committee. Technology, long ignored due to lack of resources, would become central. Surveillance, coordination, rapid response. No corner of the nation would be left exposed. But Traoré knew the dream alone wouldn't be enough to fuel such a sweeping change. He needed resolve, he needed his people, and he needed to speak, not just as a soldier, but as a leader with a vision, a leader ready to break the silence. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who understands the stakes of leadership and the courage it takes to challenge an entire system. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us as this extraordinary journey unfolds. What Traoré sets in motion will shake the foundations of power, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the region. The blueprint for S24/7 was bold, even by Traoré's standards. He presented it not as a plan, but as a declaration. Burkina Faso would no longer be a passive recipient of security, but an active architect of its own peace. The first step was restructuring the nation's defense framework into a real-time adaptive system that left no hour or corner unattended. He began by overhauling the nation's surveillance capabilities. Within weeks, his administration authorized the installation of smart street cameras across major urban centers: Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, Kaya, and Fadangourma. These cameras were not just for monitoring traffic or catching petty criminals. They were designed to create a live web of visibility, connecting neighborhoods and security outposts with one goal: anticipation. Traoré understood that in asymmetric warfare, reaction was failure. Only proactive intelligence could outmaneuver the insurgents who thrived in shadows, but technology alone wasn't enough. The heartbeat of S-24-7 would be human, the people themselves. Traoré turned to a long-ignored resource, the civilian population. He resurrected and expanded the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, or VDPs. These weren't formal soldiers, but local men and women, trained quickly and equipped modestly, committed to defending their own villages and streets. Every region was required to establish a VDP unit. Farmers, teachers, artisans, anyone over the age of 18 could apply, provided they passed a background check and swore an oath to the Constitution. The oath mattered. It wasn't a pledge to Traoré, but to the land and the people. These weren't militias, they were guardians. Training camps sprouted near strategic zones, staffed by military veterans who had seen the worst of the conflict. They taught surveillance techniques, emergency communication protocols, and basic arms handling. But more than tactics, they instilled purpose. For decades, the people had felt helpless, trapped between terrorists and corrupt politicians. Now they had agency. Not everyone was convinced. Opposition groups cried foul, calling the program dangerous and amateurish. They warned of creating armed civilians without oversight, predicting chaos and abuse. International organizations raised eyebrows, cautious of the legal implications and possible human rights violations. But Traoré pressed on undeterred. He believed the risk of inaction was far greater. Even within his own circle, there were murmurs of dissent. Generals who had spent years studying Western doctrine felt sidelined. Bureaucrats resented the speed of the rollouts. But Traoré didn't flinch. He held nightly briefings, reviewed surveillance data personally, and issued direct orders when delays occurred. His energy was relentless, infectious. Those who once doubted now watched with awe as villages previously deemed ungovernable reported calm. One evening, in the village of Nasumbu, an ambush was thwarted. A VDP unit intercepted a radio signal using one of the newly issued scanners. Within minutes, they coordinated with a military patrol stationed 20 kilometers away. By dawn, the threat was neutralized. No civilian casualties. For the first time in months, a region celebrated not survival but success. Word spread quickly. More volunteers signed up. Mothers brought food to the training camps. Traditional leaders, once hesitant, offered blessings. Something was shifting, not just structurally but spiritually. Still, Traoré knew that building a defensive wall was not enough. To make S-24-7 endure, it needed resources, resilience, and reach. That meant looking beyond the barracks and into the nation's veins, its wealth, its alliances, its image. The next phase would demand even more audacity. And if you're still here, it means you're witnessing the evolution of a new kind of leadership. Unapologetically bold, fiercely rooted in identity. The most critical moves are yet to come. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Traoré turns his focus from the battlefield to the balance sheets. The momentum behind S-24-7 was unmistakable, but Captain Traoré knew that sustaining it required more than vigilance and manpower. Security could not be separated from economic sovereignty. For too long, Burkina Faso's natural wealth had benefited everyone but its own citizens. It was time to reclaim what was buried beneath their feet. The first target was gold. Burkina Faso is among Africa's top gold producers, yet the majority of its mines were controlled by foreign companies. Traoré moved swiftly. He signed a decree nationalizing select strategic mines and declared the creation of a state-owned mining company tasked with managing exploration, extraction, and profit redistribution. The revenues, he insisted, would fund not only the expansion of S-24-7, but also education and infrastructure in marginalized regions. The backlash was immediate. Western investors panicked, the market trembled, and international media branded the move as reckless. But at home, Traoré's popularity soared. For the first time, people felt the riches of their land might serve their own future. He toured mining towns himself, walking through shafts, talking to workers, promising fair wages and safer conditions. This gold, he told them, will no longer finance foreign luxury. It will build Burkinabe dignity. But cutting economic ties was not just about money, it was about ideology. Traoré began to re-evaluate the nation's alliances. For decades, Burkina Faso had aligned itself with Western powers, accepting aid and military training with strings attached. Yet, what had decades of alignment achieved? Poverty persisted, insurgency thrived, sovereignty eroded. A shift began, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Traoré sought out new partners, ones who offered respect without paternalism. Russia stepped in, proposing military equipment, training programs, and logistical support. Other Eastern nations followed, presenting infrastructure investments and resource-sharing deals with fewer political conditions. This pivot stirred unease in foreign embassies. Diplomatic cables buzzed with concern over the redirection of regional power. But Traoré was unmoved. He wasn't looking east because it was trendy. He was looking for leverage. For alliances that respected Burkina Faso as an equal, not a subordinate. Domestically, the new policies split public opinion. Urban youth and rural communities largely rallied behind him. They saw opportunity where before there was only stagnation. They saw a leader who acted, not just spoke. But in the capital's elite circles, whispers of discomfort grew louder. Some worried about diplomatic isolation. Others feared losing international funding. Still, Traoré continued. To bridge the gap between policy and perception, he launched a media strategy. Government-run radio stations began airing daily updates on S24/7's progress. Local journalists were invited to cover mining reforms and foreign delegations. Social media platforms showcased images of VDP units patrolling markets, children returning to school, and newly built watchtowers rising from the earth. The messaging was clear. A new Burkina Faso was not only possible, it was already emerging. Traoré understood the power of narrative. For years, Burkina Faso had been cast as a fragile state, a pawn in larger geopolitical games. He wanted to change that script. Through carefully crafted communication, he began to reshape the national identity, not as victims, but as architects of their own destiny. Yet beneath the surface, pressure mounted. The speed of change rattled old structures. Former allies turned silent. Internal cracks began to form. While the world watched Traoré climb, others plotted how to pull him back down. If you're following this story, you've seen how vision becomes structure, and how structure begins to shift the world around it. But not everyone supports this new direction. Stay with us, subscribe now, because what happens next will test Traoré's strength more than anything before. Success breeds enemies. As Traoré's new Burkina Faso began to take shape, opposition forces, both visible and hidden, moved into position. The reforms had not only disrupted entrenched economic interests, but also unsettled long-standing political networks. And in the shadows of change, resentment grew. Inside the government, cracks deepened. Some senior officials who had once applauded Traoré's boldness now questioned his methods. They whispered that his vision had become obsession, that the pace of reform ignored the need for consensus. Military officers, sidelined by the growing influence of VDP units, began holding quiet meetings of their own. Dissent, once unthinkable, started to organize. At the same time, reports emerged of abuses within the VDP ranks, accusations of intimidation, arbitrary detentions, even violence. Traoré acted swiftly, suspending units under investigation and reinforcing training protocols. He knew these mistakes, if left unchecked, could unravel the very legitimacy he had worked to build. But to his critics, this was proof that civilian-based defense was unstable, even dangerous. International organizations were quick to amplify the criticism. Human rights watchdogs issued reports condemning the government's crackdowns on protesters and journalists. Headlines in foreign media painted a picture of authoritarianism rising behind the facade of nationalism. Western leaders demanded accountability, hinting at sanctions. The same voices that had once ignored the suffering of Burkinabe villages now claimed moral urgency. Traoré remained outwardly composed, but privately, the pressure weighed heavily. He was not blind to the irony. Having sought to break free from foreign control, he now faced the full fury of its backlash. But retreat was not an option. The dream still burned in him, vivid and uncompromised. Then came the first coup attempt. In the dead of night, a faction within the military tried to seize control of key installations in Ouagadougou. They cut communications, stormed a government facility, and demanded Traoré's resignation. But the plan unraveled quickly. Loyalists, tipped off by VDP informants, mobilized. Within hours, the attempt collapsed. Dozens were arrested, some fled, a few vanished. The capital was shaken, but Traoré's response was cold and calculated. He did not declare victory. He addressed the nation with the same clarity that had defined his rise. This is not about me, it's about who decides our future, us, or those who fear our freedom. The failed coup galvanized many. Rallies erupted in support of the government. Citizens filled the streets, waving flags, chanting his name. Traditional leaders reaffirmed their loyalty, but not all were cheering. Behind the applause, other plots were being drawn. 2 months later, another coup attempt. This time it reached closer. Explosions near the Ministry of Security, gunfire in the outskirts. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain. And then, silence. Once again, loyal forces prevailed, but just barely. The events left Traoré bruised, politically and emotionally. He could no longer ignore the scale of the resistance. What he had triggered was not just reform, but revolution, and revolutions do not move forward without enemies. Yet amid the turbulence, support endured. In rural areas once plagued by fear, farmers returned to their fields. Schools reopened, markets thrived. The dream had not vanished, it was fighting back. Still, a question loomed. Could the new Burkina Faso survive the weight of both external pressure and internal betrayal? Could vision alone withstand the pull of power and the cost of loyalty? You're watching a story unfold where each chapter is written not in speeches, but in sacrifice. If you believe that real change never comes easy, subscribe now. Because the final test of Traoré's resolve is coming, and its outcome could redefine a continent. By the end of the second year of Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, the ground beneath Burkina Faso had shifted, politically, socially, and emotionally. The weight of transformation was evident, not just in policies or statistics, but in the spirit of its people. What began as a vision in a dream had evolved into a national awakening. Attacks that once terrorized entire provinces were now met with rapid, coordinated responses. In the Eastern Corridor, where entire communities had once fled, markets reopened and children walked to school under the watchful eyes of newly built watchtowers. The VDP units, refined, better trained, and closely monitored, became respected symbols of resilience. Their uniforms, once a patchwork of whatever could be found, were now standard, representing a unified front against fear. Reports from international observers reluctantly acknowledged a drop in terrorist incidents. Local media, previously cautious, began celebrating success stories. Mothers whose sons had vanished in previous years now led community meetings. Farmers, no longer forced to pay bribes to move goods across regions, expanded their plots. It wasn't peace, but it was progress. Traoré's vision was no longer just his. It had been adopted, tested, and in many places, embraced. Yet he knew the journey was far from complete. To ensure sustainability, he created local advisory councils to oversee implementation of reforms, ensuring that decisions were made with community input. These councils, composed of elders, youth, religious leaders, and educators, helped translate the national policy into local action, creating trust where there had once been only suspicion. In parallel, his administration launched educational programs focused on national history and civic responsibility. The goal was to cultivate a generation that understood not just what was done, but why. A generation that wouldn't wait for saviors, but would instead see themselves as the stewards of their own land. Despite this momentum, Traoré remained grounded. He declined lavish ceremonies. He continued to walk markets unannounced. He listened more than he spoke. His leadership had never been about grandeur. It had always been about direction. In a private address to his inner circle, he reflected on the path behind them. They called us reckless, they called us dreamers, but dreams only scare those who fear change. We didn't win every battle, but we changed the terrain. That terrain had indeed changed. Foreign influence, while not entirely gone, had diminished. National resources were now under national control. The state no longer outsourced its protection, and most importantly, the people had begun to believe again, not in a man but in themselves. Still, Traoré understood that power must always be held with caution. He began laying the groundwork for succession, not through favoritism, but through preparation. Leadership, he believed, was not ownership. It was stewardship. As the country prepared to mark its next independence anniversary, the mood was palpably different. Streets were lined not just with flags, but with murals of community heroes, VDP members and farmers. The message was clear. This was a people's victory. And so, the dream that once startled a young captain in the dead of night had come full circle. It no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Burkina Faso. If you've followed this story, you've seen how a single vision can spark a movement, how courage can override fear, and how leadership rooted in purpose can reshape a nation. Don't let the journey end here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story of transformation. And if you're ready for another chapter of bold leadership, click the video on your screen now. The world is full of silent revolutions. This was just one of them.